In this video, we'll get started with transformers with a high-level overview. Let's dive right in. Transformers, an overview. Transformers were introduced in 2017 by a group of researchers at Google in this by now seminal paper, Attention is All You Need. And the title of this paper already shows how important attention is to the architecture of transformers. Transformers strongly improved the state of the art in machine translation, and before transformers, what performed best there was actually recurrent neural networks with an attention mechanism. And this paper showed that you can actually get rid of the recurrent neural network and only depend on particular types of attention mechanisms in order to obtain state-of-the-art performance. This figure shows how you get clearly state-of-the-art performance using these transformers in this machine translation task. But machine translation is not the only task for which transformers achieve state-of-the-art performance. In contrast, by now, they have become one of the most popular types of neural networks. And actually, models based on transformers, such as BERT and GPT-3, have revolutionized the field of natural language processing, NLP. Transformer-based architectures also achieve very strong performance for some other modalities. For example, in computer vision, there's these vision transformers, and for speech recognition, there's conformers. For example, also AlphaFold uses transformers for protein folding. Some work in our own group uses transformers for RNA folding. They are very universal and very strong sequence models. And all these figures here show that, transformers are clearly on the rise with an exponential number of publications over the years. So I mentioned before that transformers remove the need for recurrent neural networks. And this is important because, well, recurrent neural networks, they have to handle the inputs one by one in the sequential form. And that makes parallel training very hard, whereas the transformer actually takes in the entire sentence as a single input, and then actually, well, it has several layers and acts on these inputs in parallel, whereas the previous RNN architecture worked on one input word at a time. And transformers, using these different concepts of attention, can get rid of this sequential information processing. And one advantage that they also have by doing so is that they can very easily capture long-range dependencies. RNNs can in principle also do that. RNNs in principle have good storage capabilities if you have gated RNNs such as LSTMs, but if you have very long sequences, then it becomes very hard to learn the dependency between, say, the first word in a sentence and the 50th word in a sentence. Whereas for transformers, this is just all part of the same input. Now, on a high level, the transformer architecture looks as follows. So you have as an input a sentence, and so this is a single input is the whole sentence. This gets fed into an encoder stack and an encoder block, and then the output of that goes into another encoder, the output of that goes into another encoder, etc., etc. So these are just stacks of the same type of architecture. And then you have a representation which is inputted into the various different type of decoder blocks. But the output of this first decoder here is also the input of the second decoder, the third decoder, fourth, fifth, sixth, etc. And then in the end, you have the output. Now here we have 6 encoder blocks and 6 decoder blocks that was the architecture that was proposed in the original paper, but there's really no necessity for there to be exactly the same number of encoder blocks as decoder blocks. You could, in principle, also have more decoders or more encoder blocks. Now, the main components of the encoder are a so-called self-attention layer, followed by a feed-forward layer. And we will see self-attention in the following video in detail. And the decoder block on top of this also has this encoder-decoder attention. Now, this encoder-decoder attention works very similarly as the encoder-decoder attention we've seen in the context of attention for RNNs. But the self-attention works a little bit differently. And that's why we have a whole separate video for that one. To understand transformers at a high level, it's very useful to look at the flow of vectors through the encoder. So where we're talking about neural machine translation, and well, there's these words that are inputs. These words, well, they get encoded into vectors, and these vectors have a particular size, little d, and in the original paper, this d is set to 512. And this encoding size is actually going to stay constant throughout the entire transformer. So each word, the vector embedding for each word is fed into the first self-attention layer. And this is for all the words in a sentence. This is just a very short sentence with 2 words. And then this results in a transformed representation of each of the words. Then the same feed-forward neural network is applied to each of the words. And this again yields a transformed representation. And this transformed representation then gets fed into the next encoder. Now, as I mentioned before, the self-attention block here operates on all of the inputs jointly, and then each input is passed through the same feed-forward neural network. And so you can see this encoder block as taking this embedding of a word and producing another embedding of the word that also takes into account the context of this word in the entire sentence. And that is the case because of the self-attention. In that self-attention stage, you actually get to talk to all the other words in the sentence and basically get parts of their embeddings as your own embedding. And well, more details will become clear when we talk about self-attention in the next video. And this brings us to the end of this lecture. And as always, I'd like to leave you with some questions for you to activate the material. I'll see you in the next video. Thank you.